Well, I needed to make money, and when you're 12 years old, they won't hire you at a steel mill. So I thought, what can I do? And I'd been reading comics, and I thought, hey, I think I could do that.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and I like to talk about some of the older stuff, people who really left a lasting legacy in the comic book industry. And one of those guys, he has an air about him. You would think that maybe, in some people's mind, might be the greatest editor in comic book history. Jim Shooter, the legend of Jim Shooter. You hear about him a lot. And here with me today to talk about the legend of Jim Shooter is Eric Breen. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing well. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. So when I approached you about this subject, your eyes lit up and you got a little giddy. I could see it by your body language. What is it about Jim Shooter that really attracts you to his track record and what he stood for in the comic book industry?
Well, to really understand how important he was to the industry, a little background, knowledge might be good. Yeah, I don't know if everybody knows, but Jim Shooter started in comics at age 13 when he said at age 13 he read comics as a kid, but had given them up and then started back. So he was already on his second time as a reader, just as he turned 13. And he was reading DC and he said, I can do this. So he wrote and drew some Legion stories that he submitted. Legion editor at the time, Mort Weisenberg, liked him so much he wanted to buy him. So he contacted Jim Shooter, and having no idea that this was by that time a 14-year-old kid, and he had to wait till school was out so his mother could bring him to the DC studios to finalize the deal. And he ended up writing several Legion stories. Actually wrote for a couple of years, and he ended up writing a lot of DC books in the late 60s and into the early 70s. And he left for a while. He came back after college, and then by that time he didn't get along with the DC editors at the time. And so Marv Wolfman called him in 1975 and offered him a job in editorial. And by that time Shooter was 24, and Marvel's editor-in-chief Wolfman at the time wasn't even 30 yet. So it was a different landscape in those days. But and Marvel had so much editor-in-chief turnover in those days that it only took Shooter 3 years to be given the job in 1978. So here he is, running Marvel at age 27.
Yeah, that's insane just to think about a 27-year-old. But at that point, he had 14 years of industry experience. It's crazy that, he was absolutely a wonderkind. That there's no denying that. He was a prodigy when it came to comic book writing. The idea of what makes or goes into a good comic book, story. When he became the editor-in-chief, he has a reputation of really being on top of things and maybe being a bit of a micromanager, maybe a bit of a taskmaster. Was that the way you understood it as a reader when he was the editor-in-chief at Marvel?
Well, it was one of those things you didn't notice at the time because in those days, there was no internet. There was barely a fan press. Even like the comic book magazines hadn't really come along yet. So we found out all this stuff years later. But, at the time, Marvel, it was a very loose operation. Stan had long since given up the day-to-day operation. He was more interested in growing the properties in Hollywood. And, he had, his eyes were already in California if he himself wasn't yet, which was right around the same time. But Jim Shooter, what he realized that maybe previous editors hadn't was it was time to take everything seriously as a company because there were ways to grow the company beyond just the books and maybe the occasional cartoon and the licensing. So he, I guess, adopted kind of a philosophy that no one is bigger than the comics themselves. So, he made sure that the books were done to the best of the creator's abilities and always on time. Because one thing I know, when I first started reading Marvel, any given month you could buy a book, you could open it up and find out it's a reprint from a story 5 years ago. I mean, they even had a name for it. They called it the dreaded deadline doom. And it was almost like a joke at Marvel, but there were probably a dozen that I could, if I did a little bit of research, where you just open it up and, hey, the story I was reading is going to be another month late. And all of that ended under Shooter. So the deadline was everything to him. That may not have always worked out the best, in hindsight, but if you're going to run a company, you have to, I guess his way of looking at it, you have to have rules and you have to stick to them.
Absolutely. You got to have standards. You have to have, when you have a deadline, you have to meet it. And if you're not going to meet the deadline, let's figure out how we can do it. It seemed like that was kind of the leader that he was. And he was a prodigy. He was an integral part of Marvel's legacy and really helped grow the company. But after a point in time, Marvel fell into some hard times. They kind of went into bankruptcy and there was a lot of legal wranglings. And Jim Shooter himself almost owned Marvel Comics. Like he had put an investment group together. He was this, and my fingers are very close. He was this close to actually owning Marvel Comics outright.
That would have been very interesting because it's weird. Shooter's one of those guys that history has treated rather kindly. When he was fired from Marvel in '87, I think the prevailing opinion among fans was, thank God. Because I don't think they appreciated what they had. Because that you over at DC, you had Alan Moore doing Watchmen, you had Frank Miller doing Dark Knight, and you had Shooter keeping the trains running on time. And you may not always appreciate that until you look back and see what 10 or 10 years down the road, or especially like what Marvel went through in the early 2000s. But getting back to Shooter's tenure, when you think about all the things he did at Marvel that made it possible for anything Marvel did after that, when you think of the greatest runs in Marvel history, now take out Stan and Jack, but anything post Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, what runs come to mind? And for most people, it's Frank Miller's Daredevil, Walt Simonson's Thor, Claremont and Burns' X-Men, and Burns' Fantastic Four. All four of those runs took place under Jim Shooter. So say what you will about him, he allowed his creators the freedom to do the runs that are still well respected to this day. And he's the one that I said it was Secret Wars was his brainchild. Unfortunately made for him, so was New Universe. Although it's interesting, something that was just mocked terribly when it came out, they're mining stories and characters from 30-something years later. The latest Avengers storyline is Star Brand centric, and that was one of his characters in the New Universe.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, DC Comics was out there doing this cutting edge, you've never seen Batman like this, or Watchmen, you've never seen this superhero universe like this. It's like nothing you've ever seen. Whereas over at Marvel, you have Jim Shooter. And what can you say about Walt Simonson's Thor? You've never seen a better representation of what Thor really is. Frank Miller's Daredevil is definitely a deconstruction of the character, but that is essentially who the character is nowadays. That is Daredevil. You see that basic story redone in different ways over and over as time goes on. And when you think of what is the ultimate epitome of what an X-Men story or what an X-Men run is, Chris Claremont and John Byrne. Looking back at it in hindsight, some of the cutting edge things that they were doing at DC might not have been happening over at Marvel, but what was happening at Marvel was truly timeless and basically set the standard for those characters until today even.
Well, there's a reason why Marvel has never had a crisis event. They've never needed one. Now, you could argue whether they could use one now, but that's neither here nor there. And so I said, yeah, Marvel couldn't boast a Watchmen or a Dark Knight, but DC couldn't boast a Simonson Thor, Miller Daredevil, Claremont X-Men. None of their books had runs you could point to and go, this will be talked about forever, in comic circles. And how much of that you can credit to Jim Shooter is up for debate. But the fact was, he was the man in charge, and Marvel had, a very good creative period in the 9 years he was there. And I don't think that can be debated.
It's interesting that, his leadership in the editor-in-chief position was only 9 years, but the legend it seems to grow year by year. And I think hindsight being 2020, readers really appreciate and respect what he was able to do at Marvel Comics, because you've got so many timeless classic runs out of it. And Marvel was a well-run company. Their comic books came out on time. You were assured of a certain quality as far as the writing and the art, things you do not get, at Marvel Comics. I do think you get that to a point to DC, but you do not get that with Marvel Comics today. And I think people long for that. And Jim Shooter was a big part of that. And I think that's why, even though he only was in charge for 9 years, he's as influential as any editor-in-chief at Marvel history other than Stan Lee.
Oh, I agree. And I think part of that was, like I said, he was a creator himself, so he could understand both sides of it. But he was one of those guys. When it was time to go from creator to editor-in-chief, he was able to separate the two and understand that there needed to be, that's two different things. And I think that's how his tenure also, I mean, he had some well-publicized, fights with, John Byrne, Steve Gerber, Marv Wolfman. I mean, he's the reason why Marv Wolfman went to DC. I'm sure he chased Byrne over to DC. So again, even with losing high-profile creators, he understood that you've got to keep the books going, and he managed to do that despite the losses that their personality clashes led to.
By doing that, we got probably maybe the greatest team-run book in DC Comics history, and we got the best version of Superman we've ever seen.
Absolutely.
Jim Shooter's history in the industry is kind of strange. He did have that amazing run, but it's all been bittersweet. He really hasn't gotten, I think, what he wanted out of the industry. Like I mentioned earlier, he was a cunt hairs away from owning Marvel Comics outright as the lead member of a finance group. Weird shenanigans went on, and it, of course, ended up with Ike Perlmutter. He tried to open up his own rival comic company with its own shared universe, Valiant Comics. As soon as he started getting traction and the quality was there, it sold to Acclaim, right out from under him, and he gets fired.
Yeah.
It seemed like he never got what he wanted after his 9 years at Marvel. And I do think that's disappointing. What are your thoughts about his tenure in the comic book industry after Marvel?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a lot of starts and stops. He did eventually go back to Acclaim for a while, I think in the late 2009, 10 area, and he also went back to DC and wrote some Legions in 2009. So I'm really not all that familiar with what he's been doing since then. So I don't know if somebody actually were to approach him about coming back to one of the major companies, if that even be something he would be interested in, or if it would even be doable. And they say the old time coaches couldn't coach in today's sports because the athletes are so different. And I don't know if that's the same in comics. If the Shooter approach just couldn't even get out of the gate today. But because I know after the DiDio news, some people the first person a lot of people thought it was, man, would it be great if Jim Shooter got the job? I don't know if it would. I mean, I think it would be, but I don't know if today's creators, certainly not at Marvel. They would just absolutely melt down.
Being a member of the military, I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and I saw the changing of the work environment of what the standard was of how you were able to implement discipline or maybe talk to your subordinates and your coworkers. And it just the office environment has changed, even the military. So I can't imagine if the people at DC thought Dan Didio was too much and had to make complaints about the office environment, if they would actually be able to appreciate and thrive under the Jim Shooter approach. And that's too bad because they could all learn something from him.
I couldn't agree more.
Do you think that Jim Shooter has one last go in him? Maybe just a short run or a mini series where he goes and he shows all the young whippersnappers out there, maybe Donnie Cates, how it's really done, how the old guard still got it in him. Do you think that's going to happen?
I don't think it will. And I don't know if it's if he's got one more story in him, but I would think if I had a company that had just lost its, publisher, and I needed to fix a handful of mistakes from the last couple of years, and I wanted to bring in somebody to, right the ship and get ready to transition to someone long term, you could certainly do worse than Jim Shooter.
Eric, I do want to say thank you very much for joining me today and talking about the legend of Jim Shooter. For such a short amount of time in the position, he left an indelible legacy, something that readers from the ages of 20 all the way up to 50, 60 years old all look back at and say, that is an example of excellence in the comic book industry. He has a track record of excellence in the comic book industry, specifically at Marvel while he was the editor-in-chief. He rubbed some people the wrong way. Maybe some people had to leave Marvel because they didn't enjoy his approach. But I think the people that truly were the winners out of all of that were the customers. And I think that's what's most important in the end. So thank you so much for giving some perspective on Jim Shooter and his legacy, his legend. Is there anything you want to say before we sign off?
No, I think we pretty much covered it. I said, if you want to read some of the stuff that he did as a comic book writer, again, his Wikipedia page is 99% accurate, and you'll find that he wrote a heck of a lot more stuff than you realize. And now, one thing I will say real quick, he wrote the Korvac saga in the Avengers in 1977, which is considered one of the great Avengers stories of all time. So the man could write too, and that gets lost, amongst all the bombast of his personality as editor-in-chief. But man, was a heck of a writer.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Dropping knowledge bombs like they're going out of style, Eric.
Appreciate you having me. Anytime.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.